Hi, everyone. So this week we are going to be focusing on the results section. And we have two lectures to listen to in this week and I think also in next week, if I can recall. So this first lecture, what we're going to do is we're just going to look at the results section broadly, and we're going to talk about what the results section is. And then the next few lectures are going to zero in on the results section and qualitative data. And then the final lecture in this class will be the results section and quantitative data. So again, for this lecture, we're just going to zero in on what are the results, what exactly is this section in the thesis. So if you can recall, the thesis has 5 chapters, and those chapters are the introduction, the literature review, the methods, the results, so we're in chapter 4 now, and the discussion. So, this is also true with journal articles. When you are reading journal articles, really start to pay attention to how they're organized. And what you're going to find is that a lot of times, this isn't all journal articles, but a lot of times you are going to see that a journal article is organized in the same manner, where a lot of times you will have an introduction, literature review, methods, results, and discussion. So, if you are completing a 5 chapter thesis, this lecture is really going to help you tremendously. If you are reading journal articles, this lecture is going to help you. Also, this lecture will also help you if you are completing the final project, because you may have some analyses and you will actually have a results section for the final project. It's just that the results tend to be for the final project tend to be a more creative output. Okay, so let's kind of dive into it. And the results section is basically this is the chapter where you present the findings from the study. What's important here is that in this chapter, you are basically talking about what you found. What are the results? And you're doing this objectively, and you're also doing this without any interpretation or commentary or your opinions or anything like that. So, what I find is I tend to find that this chapter, chapter 4, is one of the easier chapters to write because, again, you're just stating, here are the results. This is what we found with this particular study. The results also basically answer your purpose statement or your research questions, or they may test your hypotheses using the data collected during your study. Now, most of our students do not do hypothesis testing because a number of our students are conducting studies that are purely qualitative. But all of you probably have a solid purpose statement. Some of you may have research questions, and that's basically what the results are doing. It's answering those questions. So, this section provides evidence to support your analyses and conclusions. Okay, so to reiterate, and this is really important, is I kind of have that below. It's the facts, just the facts. You are only including the results in this section, in this chapter. You don't need to repeat the methods. You don't need to interpret what the findings are. In other words, in the results section, you're not going to talk about what the findings mean. That is for chapter 5, which is the last chapter in the thesis. Let me back up though just a little bit. Sometimes you will find, you'll see this in journal articles, and sometimes some of our students do this as well. There are situations where the results and the discussion can be combined. This happens if the study is purely qualitative, usually. Okay. So this is not unheard of. Sometimes you will see where, again, the results and the discussion are combined. But for the most part, I would say the most common method is that you have a results chapter, which is chapter 4, and you have a discussion chapter, which is chapter 5. And we will talk more about the discussion chapter in the next lecture. But again, the important thing to remember here is that the results are just the results. It's what you found, it's the findings for the study, and there is no interpretation of what those findings mean. Okay, so if we look at the structure of the results, and we're going to look at this in just a minute, is typically you start this section maybe with a brief paragraph that describes what will be covered. Okay. Because remember, you're leading the reader from the method section to the results. And a lot of times it's important to remind the reader of what's going to happen in this section. And a lot of times you'll also see this section may start with describing the sample. And this is really important because in the method section, you told us who the sample was going to be. So you might have said, maybe you were using a purposive sampling technique, maybe you were using a convenient sampling technique. And in the results or the findings, now you got to tell us exactly who the sample is. So maybe you ended up interviewing 12 people who were project managers in various companies, and you probably should describe that sample. Who were these project managers? How many years of experience did they have? Maybe you need to give age or gender or any kind of descriptive statistics that you collected that are important to your study need to be explained. And I say this is important because a lot of times our students forget to do this. They don't describe exactly who the sample ended up being. So a lot of times that's how the results will start. Then you want to use headings, and headings tend to work really well in the results because this is where you can start to organize the results either according to subsections that happened in your purpose statement. You can also organize the results according to research questions or thematic areas. So, any kind of logical groupings and headings that you can use in the results to organize your data is incredibly helpful. Some students will also organize the results in terms of phases of the study. So, for example, some students might have maybe they had three phases for the study. Maybe phase one was the questionnaire, phase two was the interviews, and maybe phase three was the workshop. And so, a good way to organize then the results might be to talk about phase one results, phase two, and then phase three. The way you present the data, again, depends on how you collected the data. So you may have used mixed methods. So you might have both quantitative and qualitative findings. If it's quantitative data, a lot of times our students will present that in the form of descriptive statistics, meaning they'll show frequencies and means. If it is qualitative data, a lot of times the students are presenting that information in terms of themes or categories, and also using illustrative quotes to reinforce those themes or categories. And again, we're going to talk more about this when we get to the lectures that deal specifically with quantitative data, how to analyze that, how to write about it, and qualitative data, again, how to analyze and how to write about that. Write about that. Remember, this lecture is giving you an overview of what happens in the results section. Okay, this is really important. You do not have to include every single result that you found. This is really important because some of our students have quite a bit of data that they have collected. So you have to synthesize. You don't have to include everything. And so what you want to do is you want to look at what results are most relevant to your purpose or your research questions or hypotheses. Remember, you have appendices in the thesis. So what you could do is, let's say you have a transcript, a Zoom transcript of your interviews. You can put that Zoom transcript into the appendix, hit the highlights, talk about what the themes from those interviews were, and then include illustrative quotes that reinforce those themes. Uh, you don't just want to include positive results. If you had negative findings, you have to include that as well. You can't just say everything was rosy and everything supported everything I wanted. You have to include negative findings as well. The biggest pitfall that I see is that students will present everything, every single thing they found in chronological order. In other words, they literally just kind of barf everything onto the page. You don't want to do that. There's a balance here between transparency, detail, and nuance. Don't forget that you have appendices that you can include. Hit the highlights, hit the results that are most relevant to your purpose statement, then have appendices, okay? So the other thing too is that you're trying to lead the reader to the discussion section. The discussion section is the interpretation of the results. In the discussion, we're going to look at what do these results mean and what do they mean in relationship to the literature review. The results are the findings, pure objective findings. Um, so you want to tell a story, you want to be objective, you don't need to editorialize your results. Again, we talked before how with quantitative data, you're probably going to be using descriptive statistics. With qualitative data, you're going to be presenting this as probably themes more than likely with illustrative quotes. And that's very important because sometimes what students will do is they'll talk about the theme. They'll say, this theme was found after our data analysis. We found this particular theme that was really important after our interview questions. But then they won't give any actual quotes of the responses from the participants to those interview questions that illustrate the theme. That is critically important because that shows transparency in data. Okay. Okay. So let's look at some results and some examples. So this is the start of a results chapter, okay? And you're going to see in this case the student is organizing this according to phases. And in phase one, this was actually a mixed methods study where phase one did include questionnaires. Phase two was interviews, and then she conducted design thinking workshops in phase three. So first she's going to do, she is organizing this by phase. So first she has the questionnaire and she says data was collected in several ways. She had a questionnaire, okay, that was given to truck drivers and then also leaders within the truck driving company. Okay. And what you're going to notice is first she's going to look at the truck driver questionnaires. And notice she tells us the sample 74 drivers completed the questionnaire. Okay. Then she starts to give us a breakdown of the sample. Here we see that the truck drivers were predominantly male, very few females. Here she starts to break it down by age. Okay. So again, this is one way that you can organize your results. You can organize your results according to phases. But notice how she gives us a brief introductory paragraph to remind the reader what she's doing. Also notice that she's giving us figures, and this is really important in the results chapter. Anytime you can show figures, very, very helpful. And you can see here, we're looking at percentages. This is descriptive statistics. Here she's describing the sample. Okay. Here's an example where she gets to qualitative data. So this is basically where she starts talking about, this is phase two, where she conducted interviews with the truck drivers and interviews with the leaders. In other words, those who are employing the truck drivers of this particular trucking company. And so what she's doing here is she's basically talking about here are themes. So the current stress management strategies that the truckers used were patience and acceptance, breathing techniques, and hobbies and personal time. So she's talking about these were the themes that were derived, okay, under this idea of stress management. And then she's giving actual quotes to support the themes. So here she has one of the themes was breathing techniques, and one of the drivers said, breathing really, try not to think too much about it. So that helps to reinforce that theme. It is really, really important that when you have your themes, you give example quotes from the participants that support those themes. Really important that you do that because, again, it shows transparency in the data. Again, she's showing us the themes. She's not giving us every single response that the truck drivers provided. That can be the transcript, can be in the appendix of the thesis. Here she's breaking it down into these themes, and then she's giving us a couple of quotes. And that usually works pretty well. Maybe a couple of quotes, 1 to 2 quotes per theme. Here you're seeing, again, more figures. Like I said, figures are really important in the results section. This is based on again, the questionnaire. So for this particular study, she had close-ended questions. And here you're going to see she's giving a figure that shows on a scale of 1 to 5 how stressful the truck driver's day was. And you can see that most of them are around in the middle at 3. Okay. These are figures that you can easily get from Qualtrics if you put your questionnaire into Qualtrics. So this is kind of illustrating the difference between quantitative data, okay, which is on the right, and qualitative data, which is on the left. On the left, we're seeing the example of an experience diagram, and this experience diagram was used as part of her data analysis when she was looking at what is an example of a truck driver good day versus a truck driver bad day. The yellow is the good day. These are the themes. Orange are sticky notes of a bad day for a truck driver. These are the themes. And then you're going to notice quotes that are reinforcing these themes. Okay. So these are all figures that are pulled from her thesis. Here's another example of a figure from a student thesis. And here the student is using affinity clustering to analyze qualitative interview data. And so you can see how she's grouping the sticky notes together. And what she's doing is she's grouping them together again by particular, it could be themes, phrases, maybe common words that are said. And again, those common words that people are saying within those interview responses or those common phrases within those interview responses, she is then determining the themes based on the interview data. And she's using affinity clustering to analyze that data. Okay. And this was actually a figure that was included in her thesis, again, to support the themes that came out of the qualitative interviews. Okay, so um that basically is an overview. Again, I'm just giving you a big picture of what happens in the results section. Don't forget just the findings, okay? It's looking at the findings from the study. Uh, in our next lecture, we're going to examine how would I analyze qualitative data, okay? Again, how can I present that qualitative data in the results section? And then the other thing the next lecture is going to do is it's going to give you also an overview of what happens in the last chapter of the thesis, which is the discussion section of the thesis. Okay, so again, if you have any questions or concerns, by all means, please feel free always to reach out to me. Our assignment, our upcoming assignment, which is assignment 4, is going to give you some practice in writing a results section. You're going to analyze some qualitative data. You're going to look at how you would analyze it. And then you're going to write up a very brief results section so that you have some practice with this so that when it comes time to writing the results section for your thesis, you have some sense of how to go about doing that. Again, feel free to reach out to me with any questions you have and keep up the great work.